September 14, 1943, somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean, 300 nautical miles southeast of Truk Lagoon. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton stood in the conning tower of the USS Wahoo, his eyes pressed against the periscope lens, watching the silhouette of a Japanese transport convoy materialize through the morning haze. 6 merchant vessels steamed in formation, escorted by 2 destroyers, their hulls riding low in the water with supplies destined for island garrisons scattered across the Pacific. Morton's executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, calculated the firing solution while the rest of the crew waited in tense silence, their submarine hovering at periscope depth like a predator preparing to strike. Every man aboard knew what Japanese commanders believed about American torpedoes. They had heard the intercepted radio transmissions, the dismissive reports from Tokyo that characterized American submarine operations as ineffective and poorly executed. Japanese naval intelligence had concluded that American torpedoes were fundamentally flawed, prone to running too deep, detonating prematurely, or failing to explode entirely upon contact. For nearly 2 years, this assessment had proven devastatingly accurate. American submarines had fired thousands of torpedoes with results that ranged from disappointing to catastrophic, and Japanese convoy commanders had grown almost complacent, confident that the underwater threat posed minimal danger to their supply lines. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What those Japanese commanders did not yet understand was that everything was about to change. The American torpedo program had undergone a revolutionary transformation in the summer of 1943, and the submarines now prowling the Pacific carried weapons that actually worked. Over the following 18 months, this technological redemption would contribute to one of the most decisive campaigns of the entire conflict, as American submarines severed the maritime lifelines that sustained Japan's far-flung empire. The story of how this happened reveals not only the triumph of engineering over bureaucratic obstruction, but also the quiet heroism of submariners who risked everything while armed with weapons they could not trust. The roots of the American torpedo crisis stretched back to the years between the 2 global conflicts, when the United States Navy developed its primary submarine weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. This weapon represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering, incorporating sophisticated features that promised devastating effectiveness against enemy vessels. The torpedo utilized a magnetic influence exploder, designated the Mark 6, which was designed to detonate the warhead beneath a ship's hull, where the explosion would break the vessel's keel and cause catastrophic structural failure. This technology theoretically allowed a single torpedo to accomplish what might otherwise require multiple hits, maximizing the lethality of each precious weapon. The problem was that the Mark 14 torpedo had never been properly tested. Budget constraints during the interwar period meant that live fire exercises were extremely limited, and the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance conducted only a handful of actual detonation tests before declaring the weapon combat-ready. The magnetic exploder was tested exactly twice, with both tests deemed successful despite concerning anomalies in the data. The torpedo's depth-keeping mechanism was calibrated using theoretical calculations rather than extensive practical trials, and its contact exploder was assumed to function correctly based on earlier designs. When American submarines went to sea in December 1941, they carried torpedoes that looked impressive on paper, but had never been validated under realistic combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Withers, commanding Submarine Force Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, began receiving troubling reports within weeks of the conflict's beginning. Submarine captains returned from patrols with tales of perfect attacks that yielded no results. They described textbook approaches, ideal firing positions, and torpedoes that either missed their targets entirely or struck them without detonating. Captain John Burnside of the USS Saury fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary target from a range of less than 1,000 yards and achieved no hits. Commander Chester Smith of the USS Swordfish launched an attack against a large transport and watched his torpedoes pass directly beneath the vessel without exploding. The magnetic exploders were supposed to detect the ship's magnetic field and detonate, but they remained silent as the torpedoes continued harmlessly into the depths. The submarine force's frustration grew exponentially as the months passed. Commander Howard Gilmore of the USS Growler conducted an attack against a convoy in the spring of 1942, firing a spread of 6 torpedoes at overlapping targets. He observed at least 4 hits through his periscope, watching the weapons strike the hulls of 2 large cargo vessels. None of the torpedoes exploded. Gilmore surfaced after the convoy passed and found one of his torpedoes floating on the surface, having failed to detonate despite a visible dent in its warhead where it had struck the enemy ship's hull. He recovered the torpedo, documented its condition, and submitted a detailed report to the Bureau of Ordnance, requesting an immediate investigation into the contact exploder mechanism. The Bureau of Ordnance responded to these reports with institutional defensiveness that bordered on contempt. Rear Admiral William Blandy, the chief of the Bureau, insisted that the torpedoes functioned exactly as designed and that the problems lay with submarine crews who failed to maintain their weapons properly or employed incorrect attack techniques. When Captain John Cromwell submitted a report documenting 12 consecutive torpedo failures during a single patrol, the Bureau responded by questioning his competence and suggesting that his crew required additional training. The Bureau's technical experts produced elaborate analyses demonstrating that the Mark 14 torpedo was functioning within acceptable parameters, dismissing the mounting evidence from combat operations as anecdotal and unreliable. This bureaucratic obstruction continued for an astonishing 18 months while American submarines struggled to accomplish their missions with defective weapons. The submarine force lost boats and men in attacks that should have succeeded, their courage and skill negated by torpedoes that refused to detonate. Commander Dudley Morton, one of the most aggressive submarine captains in the Pacific, expressed his frustration in characteristically blunt terms during a meeting at Pearl Harbor in early 1943. He told Admiral Charles Lockwood, who had recently assumed command of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, that his men were risking their lives to deliver weapons that might as well be loaded with sawdust. Morton demanded to know how many more submarines had to be lost before someone admitted that the torpedoes were defective. Admiral Lockwood shared Morton's frustration and possessed the authority to do something about it. Unlike his predecessors, Lockwood refused to accept the Bureau of Ordnance's assurances and initiated his own investigation into torpedo performance. He ordered a series of tests using live torpedoes fired against submerged nets, which immediately revealed that the weapons were running an average of 11 feet deeper than their depth settings indicated. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet was actually running at 21 feet, passing harmlessly beneath the keels of target vessels. When Lockwood presented this evidence to the Bureau, they initially dismissed it as a testing error, but the Admiral persisted until they finally acknowledged the depth control problem in June 1942. Correcting the depth-keeping mechanism improved results somewhat, but torpedoes continued to fail at alarming rates. Lockwood now suspected the magnetic exploder, which had been plagued by premature detonations in addition to its failures to detonate on contact. The Bureau had designed the magnetic influence feature to work in the Earth's magnetic field, as measured at Newport, Rhode Island, where the torpedo factory was located, but the magnetic field in the equatorial Pacific was significantly different. Torpedoes were detonating hundreds of feet from their targets, alerting Japanese escorts to the submarine's presence without damaging the intended victim. Lockwood ordered his submarines to deactivate the magnetic exploder and rely solely on the contact mechanism, a decision that drew furious protests from the Bureau of Ordnance, but immediately reduced premature detonations. Now the contact exploder became the focus of investigation. With the magnetic feature disabled, torpedoes were striking targets consistently, but still failing to detonate. Commander Lawrence Daspit of the USS Tinosa provided the most damning evidence of this failure during a patrol in July 1943. Daspit encountered the Tonan Maru No. 3, a 19,000-ton whale factory ship that had been converted to an oil tanker, riding at anchor in a shallow bay. He fired 4 torpedoes at this stationary target and achieved 4 hits, leaving the massive vessel listing heavily and clearly sinking. Daspit then moved to finish off the crippled ship and fired 11 more torpedoes, every remaining weapon aboard his submarine. 10 of the 11 torpedoes struck the tanker's hull and failed to explode. The Tonan Maru refused to sink, and Daspit returned to Pearl Harbor with his last torpedo so that it could be examined by technical experts. Admiral Lockwood was incandescent with rage. He ordered immediate tests of the contact exploder mechanism using dummy warheads fitted with instrumentation. These tests revealed a fundamental design flaw that had apparently never been detected during development. The contact exploder used a firing pin that was held in place by guides designed to prevent accidental detonation. When the torpedo struck a target at a perpendicular angle, delivering maximum force to the firing pin, the guides absorbed the impact through friction before the pin could reach the detonator. Paradoxically, the harder the torpedo hit, the less likely it was to explode. Glancing impacts at oblique angles, which delivered less force but allowed the firing pin to slide freely, were more likely to detonate successfully. The solution was embarrassingly simple. Navy machinists at Pearl Harbor modified the contact exploder mechanism by filing down the guides, reducing the friction that prevented the firing pin from reaching the detonator. This took approximately 20 minutes per torpedo and required no special equipment or expertise. Lockwood ordered all torpedoes in the Pacific modified immediately, and by September 1943, American submarines were finally armed with weapons that worked reliably. The transformation in effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. Submarines that had returned from patrols with empty torpedo rooms and minimal confirmed sinkings suddenly began reporting devastating attacks against Japanese shipping. The long nightmare of torpedo failures was finally over. Commander Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb became one of the first beneficiaries of the reliable torpedoes. Fluckey had assumed command of the Barb in April 1943 and conducted 2 frustrating patrols with the defective weapons before the modifications were completed. His third patrol, beginning in October 1943, was transformed by torpedoes that actually detonated when they struck their targets. Fluckey was an innovative and aggressive commander who specialized in night surface attacks, approaching convoys at high speed on the surface, where his submarine's low profile made it nearly invisible to lookouts on the merchant vessels. During this patrol, he sank 4 ships totaling over 25,000 tons and returned to Pearl Harbor, convinced that the submarine force had finally been given the tools to accomplish its mission. The impact on Japanese shipping was catastrophic. American submarines had sunk approximately 180 Japanese merchant vessels in the first full year of the conflict, a respectable number that nonetheless failed to significantly disrupt Japanese logistics. In 1943, with torpedoes that finally worked, they sank over 300 vessels. In 1944, the number exceeded 500. Japanese convoy commanders who had grown complacent about the submarine threat found themselves presiding over massacres, watching helplessly as their charges exploded and sank around them. The confidence bred by 2 years of American torpedo failures evaporated in a matter of weeks, as convoys that had previously transited dangerous waters with minimal losses suddenly faced near-certain destruction. Captain Toshio Miyazaki commanded the escort destroyer Shikinami and kept detailed records of convoy operations throughout the conflict. His accounts from 1942 reflect the general Japanese assessment of American submarines as a nuisance rather than a serious threat. Miyazaki noted that submarines were frequently detected and attacked, but that successful torpedo attacks were rare and often resulted from luck rather than skill. His accounts from late 1943 tell a different story entirely. Miyazaki described convoys being systematically destroyed by coordinated submarine attacks, with multiple vessels hit simultaneously by torpedoes that exploded with devastating effectiveness. He wrote that the American submarine force had somehow transformed itself from an annoyance into the most dangerous threat facing Japanese shipping. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, one of Japan's most experienced submarine captains, observed this transformation with professional respect and growing alarm. Hashimoto had studied American submarine tactics throughout the conflict and initially shared the prevalent view that American torpedoes were unreliable. He had seen evidence of this unreliability firsthand. including captured American torpedoes that had washed ashore after failing to detonate, and interrogation reports from survivors of American submarine attacks who described multiple torpedo hits without explosions. Hashimoto noted that Japanese submariners had concluded that their American counterparts were poorly trained and equipped with inferior weapons. This assessment, he later admitted, proved dangerously wrong. The statistical evidence of the transformation was overwhelming. American submarines fired over 14,000 torpedoes during the conflict, but the percentage that resulted in successful detonations increased dramatically after the 1943 modifications. Before the fixes, submarines achieved an estimated 30% hit rate, with perhaps half of those hits resulting in detonations. Afterward, the detonation rate climbed to over 90%, meaning that a torpedo that struck its target almost certainly exploded. This seemingly technical improvement had strategic consequences that rippled across the entire Pacific theater. Japanese industrial production depended on raw materials transported by sea from conquered territories, and American submarines were now positioned to sever those supply lines with ruthless efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey of the USS Harder exemplified the aggressive new spirit of the submarine force, armed with reliable weapons. Dealey was a Texan with a reputation for audacity, who specialized in attacks against Japanese destroyers, the escorts that were supposed to protect convoys from submarines. Most submarine commanders avoided destroyers, considering them too dangerous and too well armed to attack with torpedoes. Dealey attacked them deliberately, considering them legitimate targets whose destruction would make convoy operations safer for other submarines. During a single patrol in June 1944, Dealey sank 5 destroyers in 5 separate engagements, earning him the nickname Destroyer Killer, and demonstrating what American submarines could accomplish with torpedoes that actually worked. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was profound. Survivors of submarine attacks described the terror of watching torpedoes explode against hull after hull with mechanical reliability, the previous pattern of failures and duds replaced by systematic destruction. Merchant marine crews became increasingly reluctant to sail, and experienced officers applied for transfers to shore duty rather than face the gauntlet of submarine attacks. The Japanese Naval Command instituted harsh disciplinary measures to prevent desertions and abandonment of ships, but morale continued to deteriorate as losses mounted. By late 1944, some convoys were losing more than half their ships to submarine attacks, with consequences for Japanese military operations across the Pacific. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the Combined Fleet, addressed the shipping crisis in a series of increasingly desperate communications to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Toyoda reported that submarine attacks had reduced oil imports from the Dutch East Indies by over 70%, threatening the ability of the fleet to operate. Steel, rubber, and bauxite shipments had declined by similar margins, crippling industrial production at a time when Japan desperately needed aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. Toyoda requested additional escort vessels to protect convoys, but Japanese shipyards were struggling to replace losses, let alone expand the escort fleet. The American submarine campaign was strangling Japan's ability to wage the conflict, and there was little the Japanese command could do to stop it. The transformation in American submarine effectiveness drew attention from intelligence analysts on both sides of the conflict. Japanese naval intelligence attempted to understand why American submarines had suddenly become so deadly after years of relative ineffectiveness. They considered various explanations, including improvements in American training, new tactical doctrines, and better intelligence about Japanese convoy routes. What they did not initially consider was the possibility that the Americans had simply fixed their torpedoes. This reflected a broader blind spot in Japanese technical intelligence, which tended to assume that American equipment was inferior and that improvements in performance must result from tactical rather than technological factors. American intelligence, meanwhile, monitored Japanese communications and tracked the growing alarm about submarine attacks. Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor decrypted messages from convoy commanders reporting losses and from naval headquarters demanding explanations for the failures of escort forces. These intercepts revealed not only the scale of American success, but also the psychological impact on Japanese personnel, who increasingly viewed submarine attack as almost certain destruction rather than an acceptable risk. Admiral Lockwood used this intelligence to direct his submarines toward the most valuable targets and to identify gaps in Japanese escort coverage that could be exploited. The combination of working torpedoes and excellent intelligence proved devastatingly effective. Commander Richard O'Kane, who had served as executive officer under Dudley Morton on the Wahoo, assumed command of the USS Tang in late 1943 and became the highest-scoring American submarine captain of the conflict. O'Kane was a meticulous officer who planned his attacks with extraordinary precision, calculating firing angles and torpedo runs to maximize the probability of hits. With reliable torpedoes, his precision paid devastating dividends. During 5 patrols in command of the Tang, O'Kane sank over 30 vessels totaling more than 200,000 tons, more than any other American submarine. His final patrol in October 1944 was particularly destructive, with O'Kane sinking 13 ships in a series of aggressive attacks that depleted his entire torpedo load. The Tang's final attack demonstrated both the effectiveness of the new torpedoes and the continuing dangers of submarine operations. O'Kane was attacking a convoy in the Formosa Strait when he fired his last 2 torpedoes at a transport vessel. The first torpedo ran true and detonated against the target's hull, but the second torpedo suffered a gyroscope malfunction that caused it to circle back toward its launch point. O'Kane saw the weapon's phosphorescent wake curving toward his submarine and ordered emergency maneuvers, but there was not enough time. The torpedo struck the Tang's stern and detonated, sinking the submarine that had achieved more success than any other in the American fleet. O'Kane and 8 other crew members survived and were captured by the Japanese, spending the remainder of the conflict in captivity. The loss of the Tang was one of 52 American submarines lost during the conflict, but the submarine force's contribution to victory was incalculable. American submarines sank over 1,200 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling more than 5 million tons, representing roughly 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. They also sank over 200 warships, including a battleship and 8 aircraft carriers. This destruction was accomplished by a force that never exceeded more than 200 submarines, and that represented less than 2% of American naval personnel. The submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military, with approximately 22% of submariners lost, but their effectiveness justified every sacrifice. The strategic impact of the submarine campaign became undeniable by early 1945. Japanese fuel reserves had declined to critical levels, forcing the Navy to conserve oil for essential operations only. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, were too fuel-hungry to deploy on routine missions and sat idle at anchor, consuming their remaining bunker oil. Aircraft production declined precipitously as aluminum and aviation fuel imports dried up, leaving Japanese airfields populated with planes that could not fly for lack of fuel and spare parts. The Japanese army faced ammunition shortages as copper and steel shipments failed to arrive. Every aspect of Japan's ability to continue the conflict was compromised by the destruction of its merchant fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet, acknowledged the submarine force's contribution in increasingly emphatic terms as the conflict progressed. Nimitz had initially viewed submarines as supporting players in the Pacific campaign, useful for reconnaissance and commerce raiding, but secondary to the carrier task forces that would win major naval engagements. By 1944, he recognized that submarines were strangling Japan more effectively than any other element of American strategy. Nimitz wrote to Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, that submarines had achieved a virtual blockade of the Japanese home islands, and that their campaign against Japanese shipping was the most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy. The transformation in American torpedo effectiveness also had implications for the broader history of military technology and institutional culture. The Bureau of Ordnance's stubborn defense of defective torpedoes represented a classic case of bureaucratic self-protection overriding operational reality. The Bureau's experts were so invested in their design that they refused to accept evidence of its failure, preferring to blame submarine crews rather than acknowledge fundamental flaws in their weapon. This pattern of behavior has been identified in numerous other military procurement programs, where the developers of a system become its most vigorous defenders, regardless of its actual performance. The torpedo crisis demonstrated the costs of this institutional dysfunction and the importance of independent testing and evaluation. Admiral Lockwood's willingness to challenge the Bureau and conduct his own investigations was crucial to solving the torpedo problem. Lockwood was unusual among senior officers in his willingness to question technical experts and demand empirical evidence rather than theoretical assurances. His insistence on testing torpedoes under realistic conditions revealed problems that Bureau experts had dismissed as impossible, and his modifications were implemented over fierce objections from the ordnance establishment. Lockwood's approach demonstrated the importance of operational testing and the dangers of accepting laboratory results as proof of combat effectiveness. These lessons were incorporated into post-conflict procurement practices, though subsequent military programs have sometimes repeated the same mistakes. The Japanese experience of the American submarine campaign offers its own lessons about the dangers of complacency and the importance of adapting to changing threats. Japanese convoy commanders had 2 years to develop countermeasures against American submarines, but largely failed to do so, confident that American torpedoes would continue to malfunction. When the torpedoes suddenly started working, Japanese defenses were inadequate, and Japanese crews were psychologically unprepared for the onslaught. This complacency reflected broader Japanese assumptions about American technical inferiority that proved catastrophically wrong. The sudden improvement in American torpedo effectiveness shattered these assumptions and contributed to the growing demoralization of Japanese military personnel. Commander Hashimoto reflected on these failures in his post-conflict memoirs, writing with characteristic honesty about Japanese miscalculations regarding American capabilities. Hashimoto noted that Japanese naval officers had believed their own propaganda about American weakness and had failed to take American technological improvements seriously. When the Americans fixed their torpedoes, Hashimoto wrote, "We were caught completely unprepared. We had convinced ourselves that their weapons were inferior, and we paid a terrible price for this arrogance." Hashimoto's willingness to acknowledge Japanese failures made his memoirs valuable sources for historians seeking to understand the conflict from both perspectives. The human stories of the submarine campaign remained largely unknown to the American public until years after the conflict ended. Submarine operations were classified for security reasons, and the men who conducted them received little public recognition during the actual fighting. This anonymity was particularly painful for the families of submariners lost in action, who often waited months to learn the fate of their loved ones and received little acknowledgement of their sacrifices. After the conflict, returning submariners were frequently asked what they had done during the war and found that few people understood the significance of their service. The submarine force's contribution was eventually recognized by historians, but many submariners died before their achievements received proper appreciation. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey was among those who received belated recognition for his wartime service. Fluckey commanded the Barb through 11 patrols and conducted some of the most audacious operations of the submarine campaign, including a shore bombardment of Japanese installations using rockets and a commando raid that demolished a train on the Japanese home islands. He received the Medal of Honor for a patrol in which he penetrated a heavily defended harbor and sank multiple ships, including a large escort carrier. Fluckey credited his successes to his crew's skill and dedication, and to the reliable torpedoes that finally gave them the weapons they needed to accomplish their mission. He spent his post-service years advocating for recognition of submarine veterans and educating the public about their sacrifices. The legacy of the American torpedo crisis extended beyond the specific technical problems with the Mark 14 torpedo. The crisis revealed fundamental weaknesses in the American defense establishment's approach to weapons development and testing, weaknesses that would recur in subsequent programs despite the lessons of the submarine experience. The Pentagon's tendency to accept contractor assurances about weapons performance, to resist independent testing, and to dismiss operational feedback that contradicted laboratory results has produced numerous expensive failures in the decades since. The torpedo crisis should have demonstrated the importance of realistic testing and accountability for defective weapons, but these lessons have been learned and forgotten repeatedly. The men who served in American submarines during the conflict remained bonded by their shared experiences for the rest of their lives. They held reunions, maintained correspondence, and supported each other through the challenges of civilian life. Many struggled with the psychological aftermath of their service, haunted by memories of friends lost and attacks that succeeded only too well. The submarine force's high casualty rate meant that almost every veteran had lost close companions, and the isolation of submarine duty made these bonds particularly intense. Veterans described their submarine crews as families, and the loss of a boat as the loss of brothers. These relationships sustained them through decades of post-conflict life. The story of the American torpedo crisis and its resolution illustrates several enduring truths about conflict and the military institutions that wage it. It demonstrates that courage and skill are worthless without effective weapons, and that bureaucratic obstruction can cost lives as surely as enemy action. It shows that technical problems can have strategic consequences, and that solving those problems requires leaders willing to challenge institutional authority. It reveals the importance of adaptation and the dangers of complacency, lessons that apply to both sides of any conflict. Most fundamentally, it honors the submariners who risked their lives with defective weapons and who finally received the tools they needed to accomplish their mission. The Japanese merchant marine never recovered from the American submarine campaign. By the summer of 1945, Japanese shipping had effectively ceased, with the few remaining vessels confined to coastal waters and constantly threatened by American submarines and aircraft. The blockade of the home islands was complete, and Japan faced starvation as food imports disappeared entirely. The submarine campaign did not by itself end the conflict, but it created conditions that made Japan's defeat inevitable regardless of other military operations. The transformation of American submarines from ineffective nuisances to deadly predators, accomplished through the simple act of fixing their torpedoes, stands as one of the most consequential technical improvements in military history. Admiral Lockwood retired after the conflict and wrote several books about submarine operations, including detailed accounts of the torpedo crisis and its resolution. He remained proud of his submarine force and bitter about the Bureau of Ordnance's obstruction that had cost so many lives. Lockwood believed that the torpedo problems could have been solved years earlier if the Bureau had been willing to listen to operational feedback, and he devoted considerable energy to ensuring that this lesson was not forgotten. His accounts of the torpedo crisis remain primary sources for historians studying the American submarine campaign and the institutional failures that nearly defeated it. The transformation in American torpedo effectiveness had consequences that extended far beyond the technical specifications of the weapons themselves. It changed the strategic balance in the Pacific, demoralized Japanese naval personnel, and vindicated submariners who had risked their lives with weapons they could not trust. It demonstrated that technological improvements could have strategic effects as significant as any tactical victory, and that solving technical problems required challenging institutional authority. Most importantly, it gave American submariners the weapons they needed to accomplish their mission, allowing their courage and skill to finally produce the results they deserved. The submarine force repaid this debt many times over, contributing decisively to victory through the systematic destruction of Japanese shipping. Commander Hashimoto survived the conflict and lived to see Japan's transformation from defeated enemy to prosperous ally. He maintained correspondence with American submarine veterans and attended reunions where former adversaries shared memories and paid respects to fallen comrades on both sides. Hashimoto wrote that the American submarine campaign taught him lessons about the dangers of underestimating opponents and the importance of respecting their capabilities. He hoped that future generations would learn from these experiences and avoid the miscalculations that had cost so many lives. His willingness to engage honestly with former enemies and to acknowledge his own side's failures made him an important voice for reconciliation and understanding. The American submariners who survived the conflict carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. They had served in one of the most dangerous and effective military forces in history, and they had seen both the frustration of defective weapons and the satisfaction of weapons that finally worked. They had lost friends and achieved victories, experienced terror and exhilaration, and witnessed both the worst and best of human nature under extreme conditions. Their stories deserve to be remembered not only for their historical significance, but also for the courage and sacrifice they represent. The submarine force's transformation from ineffective to deadly, accomplished through persistence and ingenuity in the face of bureaucratic obstruction, stands as a testament to what determined people can achieve when they refuse to accept failure. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.